The transport ship docked at Facility Obsidian with a heavy metallic clang that shook the walls of the entire station. The docking clamps snapped into place, and the pressure doors slid open with a long, slow hiss. 4 guards in thick black armor marched out first, their heavy boots striking the steel floor in a steady and hard rhythm. Between them, with her wrists locked inside glowing Novite restraints, walked one human woman. Her name was Commander Mara Voss. She was not tall. She was not large or wide or powerful-looking in any way that the Veth Kali understood power. She had no claws, no armored scales, no venom glands, no secondary skeletal layer under her skin. She was just a human, 31 years old, with a dark bruise forming along her left cheek, and a pair of quiet, dark eyes that moved slowly and carefully over every single surface they passed. The guards did not handle her gently. Why would they? She was small. She was soft. And her bones were thin compared to almost every other species held inside Facility Obsidian, and her skin was so fragile it had already torn in 2 places during her capture. She was, by every single standard the Veth Kali Dominion used to measure such things, about as dangerous as a domesticated farm creature from a low-class agricultural world. The warden Sethkai stood at the far end of the receiving corridor with a data pad in one hand and the expression of a man who had already decided this was a waste of his time. He was tall and gray-skinned, with 4 narrow eyes and a long jaw that gave him a permanent look of quiet authority. He ran Facility Obsidian, the most feared prison station in the entire Dominion, and he did not appreciate having his manifest cluttered with low-threat prisoners. But he scrolled through the intake list: warlords, assassins, revolutionary commanders, a pirate lord who had once taken down a Dominion battle fleet with 3 ships, and then he reached the very last entry: human female. Age, 31. Species class, Deathworlder. Threat rating, minimal. He read that last word twice. Then he looked up at the small bruised creature being walked down his corridor, and he felt something very close to embarrassment on behalf of whoever had sent her here. "Who approved this transfer?" he asked the intake officer standing beside him. The officer checked his own pad and cleared his throat quickly. "High Command, sir. She was captured during the Kepler system engagement. Before her ship went down, she destroyed 2 Veth Kali heavy cruisers and disabled a 3rd. High Command flagged her as a person of military interest and ordered her held here until further review." Sethkai looked at her again. She was walking between 4 armed guards in full combat kit, and she looked calm. Not the kind of calm that came from defeat or exhaustion or shock. It was something else entirely, something flat and deep and very still, and Sethkai decided, after a brief moment, that it was simply the calm of a creature too simple to understand the situation it was in. Once she realized where she was and what it meant, she would fall apart like the rest. "Cell Block 7, he said. Jessen walked back toward his office. The guards moved Mara through 3 separate security checkpoints, each one heavier and more locked down than the one before it. Every door that opened required 2 separate key authorizations and a biometric scan. The walls here were constructed from pressure-hardened alloy, bonded with a continuous energy shielding layer. The cells were carved directly into the outer hull of the station itself. No external windows, no natural light, and no way for a prisoner to track the passage of time from the outside world. The air was cold and recycled and smelled of metal and silence. Mara said nothing during the entire walk. She looked at the wall junctions where the power conduits ran behind the paneling. She studied the guard rotation, counting the exact number of steps between each post, timing how long before each guard turned and reversed direction. She cataloged the security camera positions and took note of which housings looked older and which looked newer. She listened to the sound the floor panels made under her boots, because the resonance told her exactly how thick the panels were and what kind of space existed underneath them. None of the guards noticed any of this. She was just walking. She was just a quiet prisoner moving down a corridor. One of the guards, a big one with wide shoulders and slow, bored eyes, whose name tag read Drev, grabbed Mara's forearm hard as they reached the final security door. He squeezed the way some guards did, not because it was required, but because it was a reminder of size and strength and who was in control. On most species, a grip like that caused an immediate reaction, a gasp, a flinch, a pulling away. Mara looked down at the hand on her arm. Then she looked up at Drev's face with those flat, dark, completely steady eyes. She said nothing. And she did not flinch. Her expression did not shift by even a fraction. Drev let go first. He told himself it was just because the door had opened and it was time to move. But for the rest of his shift, he kept thinking about those eyes and the way they had looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, not with anything he could recognize at all. The cell door opened, and Mara stepped inside. Yet the Novite restraints were removed from her wrists, and the door sealed shut behind her with a sound like a mountain closing. The cell was a perfect cube, 3 meters in each direction, walls perfectly smooth and seamless, floor bare and cold. A single pale light panel hummed in the ceiling. There was a narrow shelf along one wall and nothing else, no tools, no objects, no weakness in the design that an ordinary prisoner would ever find. In the cell directly to her left, separated by solid alloy, was Reth, a Drakthari pirate lord who had spent 11 years inside Obsidian and whose name was still spoken carefully across 6 star systems. To her right sat Karas, a Sinvel assassin who had not spoken a single word in 4 years. The cells across the corridor held 3 more prisoners, each one a name that even children in the outer systems knew. None of them were human. They had all listened carefully to the new arrival coming down the corridor, the sound of footsteps, the tone of the guards' voices, the weight and rhythm of it all. And now, one by one, they pressed close to the narrow ventilation slots near the floor and looked through at this strange new creature. Reth looked through his slot and saw her, standing in the exact center of her cell, perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. She was not praying. She was not meditating in any way he recognized. She was not shutting down or going blank with fear. She was thinking. He could feel it, the way her stillness was not empty but full of something being built fast and quiet and very deliberately inside her mind. He sat back against his wall and said nothing for a long time. In his office, Warden Sethkai pulled up the Cell Block 7 security feed and watched the human standing still in the center of her cell. He watched for 2 full minutes. Then he set a reminder to check back in a week and returned to his other work. On the feed, in the lower corner of the screen, the automated cell timer had started the moment the door sealed shut. It read, 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. The lights in Cell Block 7 cut out all at once. There was no warning. One moment, the pale ceiling panels were humming with their cold white glow, and the next moment, everything was black and total and completely without mercy. And this was the nightly lockdown cycle, a standard procedure in Facility Obsidian designed to disorient prisoners, disrupt their sleep rhythms, and remind them at the most basic level that they controlled nothing, not even the light around them. For the Veth Kali, darkness was deeply uncomfortable. Their species had evolved under the bright twin suns of their home world, and their eyes relied heavily on bioluminescent cues to navigate in low-light conditions. For the Drakthari, and the sudden blackout caused a spike of instinctive panic that they had to physically fight back down every single night. For the Sinvel, who hunted by color spectrum vision, complete darkness was essentially blindness. For Mara Voss, it was Tuesday. She was already moving before the echo of the lights cutting out had finished traveling down the corridor. She moved low and quiet, staying close to the wall, and she did not move fast because fast was loud, and loud was stupid. Though she moved with the calm, practiced ease of someone who had spent years training in total darkness on a world where the night was not just dark, but actively hostile. Full of predators, with better senses than hers, in terrain that shifted and cracked and flooded without warning. Kepler 7b, the world she had grown up on, was a Class 9 death world. A planet so dangerous that the Veth-Kali Risk Assessment Index had flagged it as uninhabitable and moved on without a second thought. And the humans who lived there had not moved on. They had stayed and trained and died and learned and stayed again. They had built something in themselves over generations that could not be measured by a threat assessment form. Mara's fingers moved across the wall of her cell in slow, deliberate passes. Not random, not desperate, but methodical. She was mapping. Every seam, every bolt head, every micro gap between the wall panels, every place where the construction was not quite as perfect as the Veth-Kali engineers had intended. Her fingertips were more sensitive than most species gave human hands credit for, and they found what they were looking for quickly. There was a power conduit panel behind the left rear wall. She had heard its faint electrical hum during the intake walk, filed it away, and confirmed its exact position during her first 10 minutes in the cell while she stood still with her eyes closed and the guards thought she was simply standing there doing nothing. She went to the rear wall and began working the panel seam with her fingers. But first, the needle. She reached down and pressed her thumb hard against the inner heel lining of her left boot. There was a tiny, barely there seam there, sewn shut with standard thread over a hidden compartment no larger than a fingernail. Inside it sat one titanium threading needle, 8 millimeters long, thinner than a toothpick. It was standard equipment for Terran Deep Operations personnel, not listed in any gear manifest, not kept anywhere a standard pat-down would find it, because human Deep Ops soldiers were trained to hide it in exactly the place a non-human searcher would never think to check. The Veth-Kali guards had removed her boots during intake processing. They had looked at the soles, checked the heels, and pressed the outer lining. But they had not felt for the inner heel seam, because that technique was not in their manual. Their manual had been written by Veth-Kali, about Veth-Kali prisoner behavior, for use against Veth-Kali-level threats. Nobody had updated it for humans. Mara took the needle between 2 fingers and turned back to the wall panel. Across the cell block, and in the darkness the other prisoners were doing what they always did during lockdown, staying still, staying quiet, trying to sleep or at least pretend to sleep. But Reth was awake. Reth was almost always awake during lockdown because 11 years of survival in this place had rewired his sleep instincts completely. He lay on his shelf in the dark and listened to the sounds of the station, the hum of the power systems, the distant clang of a far-off door, the breathing of the cells around him. And then he heard something new. It was almost nothing, a tiny, precise scraping sound, regular as a heartbeat, coming from the new prisoner's cell. He pressed his ear against the wall and listened more carefully. The sound was not random. It was not anxious tapping or frustrated scratching. It had a pattern, 3 short movements, a pause, 2 short movements, a pause, and repeat. And it was absolutely impossibly controlled for someone who had been in a cell for less than an hour. Reth pressed his mouth close to the ventilation slot near the floor and spoke in a low voice. "What are you doing, little Death Walker?" The sound stopped. Then her voice came back through the slot, quiet, calm, and completely unbothered. "Getting out!" Reth stared into the darkness of his own cell for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, rough, disbelieving sound, because what else could he do? He had watched brilliant minds and terrifying warriors arrive in Obsidian over 11 years. He had watched them scheme and plan and rage and eventually go quiet. Nobody got out of Obsidian. The station had stood for 200 years, and in that time not a single prisoner had ever breached its outer hull. But then the sound started again from her cell. 3 short movements, a pause, 2 short movements, a pause, and Reth stopped laughing, because the sound was changing. It was not random scratching anymore. It was becoming something more precise, more layered, 2 separate rhythms working at the same time, each one hitting a different point on the panel. She was not trying to break through the wall. She was doing something to the panel's internal mechanism, something small and careful and extraordinarily patient. Reth pressed his ear against the wall again and listened with every bit of focus he had. She was rerouting the cell's internal power feed. Well, he was not an engineer, but he had been breaking into and out of secured facilities for 30 years before Obsidian caught him, and he knew the sound of someone working a power junction. She was not trying to force the lock open. She was not trying to cut through anything. She was adjusting the signal in the door's sensor so that the door would report itself as already open, so that the system would see no reason to hold it shut. He sat back against his wall. He had been here 11 years. And he had shared walls with a disgraced Dominion general who had memorized every technical schematic of the station. He had shared walls with a Sinvel hacker whose mind worked faster than most computers. Neither of them had ever done what this human woman had just thought of in her first hour in a cell in the dark, with no tools except something so small he could not even see it. He did not know what to say. He did not say anything. He just sat in the dark and listened to her work. Steady, calm and frighteningly certain. And for the first time in 11 years, something inside Reth's chest shifted in a direction he had almost forgotten existed. It felt something like hope. The precise, quiet sound continued for a long time. Then, so soft he almost missed it over the hum of the station, there was a single soft click from the direction of her cell door. A pause. Then her voice through the slot, and still completely calm. 23 minutes ahead of schedule. The cell door had drifted exactly 1 centimeter open. The timer on Warden Sethkai's security feed, still running, unnoticed, in the lower corner of his screen, read 0 hours, 47 minutes, 23 seconds. Mara did not run. Running was loud, and loud was the last thing she needed right now. She eased the cell door open just wide enough to slip through, kept her back pressed against the outer wall of the corridor, and stood completely still for 4 full seconds, listening, counting, measuring the darkness with her ears the way most people measured it with their eyes. The guard rotation was exactly as she had mapped it during the walk-in. 2 guards at the far end of the corridor, moving in opposite directions, passing each other every 90 seconds. 1 stationary guard near the security door at the near end, who shifted his weight every 40 seconds, always to the left first, and then to the right, the sign of someone whose left knee hurt and who had been standing too long. The ventilation system blew a gentle current of air from east to west along the corridor, which told her exactly where the air recycling intake was located, and that meant she knew where the maintenance shaft ran behind the east wall. She moved. She was not graceful in the way that the Sinvel assassin Karis would have been graceful, all liquid silence and impossible precision. She was something different. She was steady and efficient and deliberate, like a machine that had been designed for exactly this one task and had been running a very long time. Her boots made almost no sound because she had learned on Kepler 7b that even the smallest sound carried on a cold, still night, and the things that hunted on Kepler 7b had very good hearing. She was halfway down the corridor when the alarm went off. It was not her fault, not directly. And the cell door's sensor had been tricked into reading the door as closed, but the door was physically open by 1 centimeter, and at the 47-minute mark, the system ran an automated physical integrity check that no amount of signal rerouting could fool. It took the system exactly 3 seconds to notice the discrepancy between the sensor reading and the physical state of the door. Then, every light in Facility Obsidian came on at full brightness, and a sound like a screaming planet tore through every corridor at once. In his office, Warden Sethkai looked up from his work and saw his security feed explode with alerts. He grabbed the feed for cell block 7 and stared at an empty cell. His mouth opened. His 4 eyes went wide. He looked at the cell number, then at the manifest, then back at the feed, and then at the cell number again. The human! He hit the emergency response panel so hard the edge of it cracked. 12 guards to cell block 7 on full combat kit. Seal every internal door between blocks 3 and 9, now! Mara heard the alarm and did not panic. She had planned for the alarm. The alarm was part of the plan. Specifically, it was the part of the plan that she had called, "This will happen, and here is what I do when it does." Humans did not plan for things going right. Humans planned for things going wrong. And then planned for what to do after that went wrong too, and then planned for the thing after that. On a death world, you did not get to be surprised by disaster. Disaster was the environment. You built it into your thinking from the very beginning. She accelerated. Not to a run, but to a fast walk, because running around a blind corner inside an alien prison station was how you ran directly into an armed guard. And she took the second left instead of continuing straight. And the straight path led to the main security door, which was now sealed. The second left led to a maintenance corridor that the guards used to access the power junction rooms. And she knew this because she had listened to a faint mechanical hum coming from behind the east wall during the intake walk and correctly identified it as a high-output power regulator, the kind that needed regular manual access, which meant a maintenance corridor had to exist behind that wall, which meant there was a door into it somewhere along this section. She found the door in 11 seconds. It was not locked from this side. Maintenance corridors never were, because in an emergency, the engineering crews needed to be able to get in fast without waiting for access clearance. She slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, just as the sound of 12 sets of armored boots came thundering around the far corner of the main corridor. Inside the maintenance shaft, it was narrow and hot and smelled of burnt wiring and machine oil. She moved through it fast, counting the junction points on the right-hand wall. I'd looking for the one that corresponded to the armory access corridor on the other side. She found it at Junction 7. She pressed her ear to the panel and listened. One guard, standing still, weight distributed evenly, calm breathing. Someone who did not know yet that anything was wrong, because this section had not received the full alarm relay yet. And a 3-second delay in communication between the east and west wings of the station. She had guessed at this based on the age difference between the two sections' construction, visible in the slightly different alloy color of the wall panels. A guess, but a very informed one. She came through the panel fast and low. The guard was 2.5 meters tall and broad as a transport crate. He had combat reflex ratings 3 times above the Dominion baseline, full body armor, and a sidearm on his left hip, and a long-barrel pulse rifle across his back. He had trained for 6 years in the Vethkali military before transferring to prison security. He was, by every standard measure, extremely dangerous. He had never fought a human in his life. He had never read a report about what humans were actually like in close combat. He did not know that human bodies attacked in ways that made no biological sense to a species that had not evolved on a Class 9 death world. He did not know that humans bent their joints at angles that looked wrong and were actually terrifying. He did not know that humans had a documented tolerance for pain that medical researchers across 12 species had described, using words like disturbing and, "What do you mean they kept going?" The fight lasted 4 seconds. Mara came out of the panel at ankle height, which was not where the guard's eyes were. Then by the time he looked down, she was already standing and his sidearm was in her hand. She had not hit him hard enough to break anything important. She needed the guards mobile and not reporting a medical emergency to the warden, but she had hit him in the exact place that caused a Vethkali's lower nervous system to temporarily stop sending signals to the legs, a fact she knew from a field manual she had memorized 2 years ago during a long transport ride that had been very boring. He sat down very suddenly and stared at the wall with the expression of someone whose legs had just decided to take the rest of the shift off. She took his sidearm, his facility access badge, and his boots. Because her original boots had been processed through intake and almost certainly had a tracking chip installed in them, which was standard Veth Cayley prisoner procedure. And then she was not going to walk around the station wearing a device that announced her position to every screen in Sethkai's office. She moved fast now, through the armory corridor, up one level using a service ladder, east along the upper maintenance walkway, and then down into the communications hub, which sat in the geographic center of the station, and which was, at this exact moment, staffed by exactly two very confused technicians who could not figure out why one of their East Wing access panels had just gone offline. They were not fighters. They saw the sidearm and stepped back immediately, and she did not need to do anything else. She sat down at the main broadcast console. The communications hub had a full-spectrum transmitter, the kind that could reach every ship, station, relay beacon, and receiver within 4 light hours of the facility on any open frequency. The Sethkai used it to coordinate supply shipments and staff transfers. It had never, in the 200-year history of Facility Obsidian, been used by a prisoner. Mara opened every available frequency at once. She spoke clearly, in Galactic Standard, and she kept it short. "This is Commander Mara Voss of the Terran Deep Operations Division. Facility Obsidian is compromised. I am coming out. Get clear." She stood up, stepped over the access badge she had used to get in, and walked out of the communications hub toward the docking level. Behind her, on every receiver within 4 light hours of the station, her voice finished playing. On Warden Sethkai's security feed, in the lower corner of the screen, the automated cell timer was still running. It read, 1 hour. Exactly 1 hour. Warden Sethkai had managed Facility Obsidian for 19 years. He had handled riots. He had handled coordinated escape attempts by prisoner groups who had spent years planning together. He had handled a full-scale power failure that lasted 6 hours and left the station running on emergency lighting, while 40 of the most dangerous individuals in the Dominion tried everything they could think of. He had never once lost control of his facility. He was losing control of it now, and the thing taking it apart was one human woman who had been inside his prison for exactly 1 hour. "Find her!" he shouted at the guard response team assembled in his operations center. "She is one creature, 31 years old, no armor, no weapons except what she took off Veth in Corridor 9. She is somewhere between communications and the docking level. Send every available guard." The guard teams moved. They were professional and they were fast, and they knew this station better than anyone. But Mara knew something they did not know. She knew how they thought, and the Vethkali security response protocol was a logical system. It worked by cutting off routes from the outside in, sealing sections from the perimeter, and working inward to compress the target into a shrinking space with fewer and fewer options. It was an excellent system against prisoners who reacted, against someone who moved ahead of where the response would go rather than away from where it was coming from. It was almost useless. She was not running from the guards. She was running through the gaps they had not yet sealed in the direction they had not yet looked, using the 2 seconds of delay between each seal order being given and each seal order being physically carried out. 2 seconds was a very long time if you already knew which door you needed to reach. She moved through the station like water moving through cracks in rock, not because she was stronger than the rock, but because she was already in the places where there was space. But she reached Cell Block 7 first. This was not the most direct path to the docking level, and the guards watching the corridor feeds knew it immediately. But they did not understand why she was going back. And by the time the 2 guards near the cell block entrance had decided to hold their position rather than move toward the sound of her approach, she had come in from the maintenance access behind them. She did not hit them hard. She was not trying to hurt people on her way out, as she was trying to leave, and leaving did not require anyone to be seriously injured. It only required that certain people be temporarily unable to stand up and use a communications device. Then she reached the cell block door and hit the manual override with the stolen access badge. Every cell door in Block 7 clicked open at the same time. Reth came out first. He was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, with broad shoulders wrapped in 11 years of prison-built muscle, or in a face that looked like it had been used as a weapon more than once. He stepped out of his cell and looked at the corridor, and then looked at Mara, who was already moving toward the far door and waving one hand to indicate that he should follow if he wanted to leave. He followed. Behind them, Karis, the Sinvel assassin, slipped out of her cell like smoke and said nothing and fell into step without being asked. 2 more prisoners followed. Not all of them. Some stayed, and either too broken or too uncertain or simply too unbelieving that what was happening was real. But enough came to make the group that moved through the next 4 corridors extremely difficult for any guard team to stop. Reth was extremely helpful in this regard. He did not fight the way Mara fought. Calculated, minimal, targeted. He fought the way a Drakthari pirate lord who had spent 11 years being furious about being locked in a box fought, which was to say loudly and with great enthusiasm and with complete disregard for whether the walls he hit with guards were structural or not. He cleared 4 corridors in the time it might have taken Mara to clear 1. She let him. She had freed him for exactly this reason. She did not need him to be precise. And she needed him to be loud and large and occupying the complete and total attention of every guard in the eastern wing, while she did something quiet in the western wing that the guards would not notice until it was far too late. The plasma coolant lines. Every large station had them. Thick conduits running through the lower maintenance levels that carried superheated coolant away from the power core and out to the heat dissipation arrays on the station's outer hull. And they were completely safe as long as they were sealed and pressurized. They became a very serious problem if their pressure regulators were set to vent inward instead of outward. Not dangerous to life, since the coolant itself was not toxic but catastrophic to every piece of sensitive machinery it touched, which in a station like Obsidian meant security systems, door controls, communication relays, and the central power distribution network. Mara had identified the coolant line access points during her intake walk because they had a specific type of floor panel above them, slightly thicker, slightly different in color, with a small pressure indicator bolt in the corner that was standard across all Veth Kali infrastructure design. She found the first access point in 4 minutes. She found the second in 3. The third was right where she expected it to be based on the spacing of the first 2. She did not damage the lines. She did not cut or break anything. She simply adjusted 3 pressure regulators, each one requiring a very specific tool to operate, which she did not have, so she used the stolen sidearms power cell casing in a way that its designers had absolutely not intended, and set each one to vent on a 20-minute delay. 20 minutes was enough time to be somewhere else entirely. In orbit above the station, the Fleet Admiral Ozara had received Mara's broadcast and was now sitting in her command chair, staring at a tactical display that showed Facility Obsidian going slowly, systematically, and very thoroughly wrong. Alert signals were lighting up across the station's status map like stars coming out at night, door systems, power sectors, guard response channels, all of them flickering or going dark one by one. Her analysis officer leaned close and spoke quietly. Admiral, our estimate is now 3 separate simultaneous disruptions in progress, 1 kinetic, 1 electronic, 1 structural, and they all appear to be coordinated with each other. How many prisoners are doing this? Ozara asked. Our best current count is 1, Admiral. 1 prisoner coordinating all 3 disruptions. The others appear to be providing cover action. Ozara looked at the display for a long time without speaking. Pull every file we have on human military personnel, she said finally, and pull every file we have on Deathworld species adaptations. I want it all on my desk before this station finishes burning. Back inside Obsidian, Reth had just finished with the last guard team in the eastern wing and was jogging to catch up with Mara, who was already moving toward the docking level. He fell into step beside her and looked down at this human woman, this small, calm, so completely unhurried human woman who was bleeding from a cut above her eye and had not once, in the entire time he had been watching her, looked frightened. Not once. Not when the alarm went off. Not when 12 guards came. Not when the entire station locked down around her. Not now, moving through a burning, screaming, failing prison station with guards still shouting in the corridors behind them. When he looked at her and said the thing that had been sitting in his chest since he first heard her working through the cell wall in the dark. "You were never afraid, were you?" She glanced up at him for one brief second as they reached the docking level door. She said nothing, but the way she moved, the way she had always moved, from the very first moment she stepped off that transport ship, said everything that needed to be said. Behind them, the first pressure regulator vented. Yeah, the sound it made was very loud and very final, and it rolled through the lower levels of Facility Obsidian like the first word of a sentence that was going to end with the station going dark. Mara reached the docking bay door and pressed the stolen access badge to the panel. The door opened. Behind her, lit from inside by the warm orange glow of failing systems and venting coolant lines, Facility Obsidian, 200 years old, unconquered, at the most feared prison in the Veth-Kali Dominion, was beginning to burn. The docking bay held 7 ships. 2 were heavy Veth-Kali security transports, locked down, access codes changed, guard teams already moving toward them. 3 were supply runners with no weapons and engines too slow to outrun anything with a pulse drive. 1 was a decommissioned shuttle with a cracked hull that had been sitting in Base 6 for 8 months, waiting on a repair crew that never came. The 7th was a Veth-Kali light patrol craft, fast, armed, with a full fuel load, and a 2-person crew who were currently standing outside it with their hands up because Reth had arrived in the docking bay 30 seconds ahead of Mara and had made his presence felt in the way that 3 meters of extremely motivated Drakthari pirate generally did. Mara walked past them without slowing down. She went up the patrol craft's boarding ramp, stepped over the threshold, and then sat down in the pilot's seat. The console was in Veth-Kali script, and the control layout was completely different from any Terran vessel she had ever flown. She looked at it for exactly 6 seconds. Then she began pressing controls. She had memorized the Veth-Kali standard patrol craft layout from a captured technical manual during a mission briefing 14 months ago. She had not known at the time that she would ever need to actually fly one. She had memorized it anyway, because on a Deathworld, the difference between information that was useful now and information that might be useful later was a distinction that got people killed, and she had stopped making that distinction a long time ago. The engines started on the 3rd attempt. "Get everyone on board!" she called back to Reth, and he did, and the boarding ramp came up. And the patrol craft lifted off the docking bay floor with a wobble that was mostly because the calibration was set for a Veth-Kali pilot's hand size, and she was adjusting on the fly. She flew it anyway. In the docking bay below, the 2 security transport crews arrived and found their bay missing 1 patrol craft and containing 2 extremely unhappy crew members sitting on the floor and 1 unconscious guard who had apparently tried to intervene in Reth's boarding process and deeply regretted it. The patrol craft cleared the station's docking envelope and Mara pushed the engines to full output. The stars ahead of them stretched, and the gas giant below filled half the view screen with swirling bands of amber and gold. Behind them, Facility Obsidian hung in the dark like a lantern, lit from inside, venting long, pale streams of coolant gas from its lower hull, its outer lights flickering in irregular patterns as one system after another went offline. Fleet Admiral Ozara watched the patrol craft depart from her command ship's bridge. Her weapons officer turned from his station and looked at her. His hand was positioned above the targeting controls. He was waiting for the order. The order did not come. Ozara watched the small craft accelerate away from the station, and she did not speak for a long time. The weapons officer waited, The bridge crew waited. Everyone on the bridge of the Dominion's flagship battlecruiser waited for the Admiral to give the order to destroy one small patrol craft carrying fewer than 10 escaped prisoners. She never gave it. Finally, she said very quietly, to no one in particular, "What is the Terran military classification for the world she came from?" Her analysis officer looked it up immediately. "Kepler 7b, Admiral. Class 9 Deathworld. Extreme surface conditions, atmospheric toxicity, high gravity zones, regular seismic events, megafauna throughout most land masses. Terran population has maintained continuous settlement for approximately 300 years. 300 years, Ozara said. She said nothing else for a very long time. But then she turned away from the view screen and walked toward her private office at the back of the bridge. At the door, she stopped and spoke without turning around. "I want every Vethkali threat classification for the human species pulled and reviewed. Every single one. I want the review on my desk in 24 hours, and I want the people doing the review to not just look at physical parameters. I want them to look at everything. Cognitive adaptability, multi-failure planning, pain threshold documentation, cross-environment performance data, everything." She paused. "And find out how long she was actually inside the station before the first alarm went off." Her analysis officer checked the Obsidian security log timestamp. 47 minutes and 23 seconds before the alarm, Admiral. Total time inside the station before departure, approximately 63 minutes. Ozara walked into her office and the door closed behind her. She sat at her desk for a long time in the quiet. Then she opened a new incident report file and began to write. The report she submitted 3 hours later was 47 pages long. It covered the timeline of the Obsidian incident in precise detail. The intake, the cell assignment, the escape, the disruption of the facility's core systems, the broadcast, the departure, all of it laid out in clear and careful language. It included security feed transcripts, guard testimony, the structural damage assessments, and a complete inventory of everything Mara had used, improvised, or repurposed during her 63 minutes inside the station. The summary section was 3 words: "Do not cage." In the weeks that followed, the story spread the way important stories always spread, fast, and getting larger with every telling. By the time it reached the outer systems, it had grown considerably. In some versions, the human had been inside for 3 days. In others, she had fought her way through 50 guards. In the most dramatic version circulating along the Karath trade routes, she had destroyed the station entirely and walked out through the explosion. The prisoners who had been there knew better. Reth, who was already building a new reputation in the outer systems, with a freedom he had not expected to ever have again, heard the stories regularly and corrected one specific detail every time. Not the number of guards, not the length of time. It's not the size of the fire. He corrected only one thing. People kept saying she had been angry. They kept saying she had been driven by rage or vengeance or some burning need to prove something to the species that had put her in that cell. They kept making her into a fury, into something wild and unstoppable and dangerous in the way that storms were dangerous. Reth shook his head every time. "She was not angry," he said. "She was never angry. I listened to her work through that cell wall for 47 minutes in complete darkness, and she sounded like someone doing a job they had done 100 times before, like it was ordinary, like breaking out of the most secure prison in the Dominion was just a thing that needed doing, and she was the one there to do it, so she did it." People asked him what that meant. What was the difference between someone who escaped out of rage and someone who escaped out of what he was describing? He thought about it every time. He always gave the same answer. "Rage burns out," he said. "What she had does not burn out. It was just her. It was just what she was. Calm and certain and already 3 steps ahead and completely, absolutely sure that the problem in front of her could be solved if she worked at it long enough. He paused every time he said this, because the next part was the part that still did them all, even now. That is what none of us understood when she arrived, since we all looked at her and saw something small and soft and breakable. But what she actually was, what humans actually are, is something that spent thousands of years on a world that wanted to kill them every single day, and they just kept going. Not because they were stronger, not because they were faster, because they would not stop. They would not accept that a problem could not be solved. They just kept working, kept planning, kept thinking, kept getting back up. And eventually, every single time, the world ran out of ways to stop them before they ran out of ways to try. He looked at whoever he was talking to. That is what was in that cell. That is what Seth Kai put in a box and called minimal threat. He shook his head slowly. The most dangerous thing in the known galaxy is a human who has decided that something needs to be done. He let that sit for a moment. And she was just mildly inconvenienced. In her office on the command ship, Fleet Admiral Ozara had already begun the process of revising the Dominion's entire threat classification system for humanity. It would take months. It would cause arguments at the highest levels of Veth Kali High Command. Several senior officials would push back hard, insisting that one incident was not enough data. Ozara let them argue. She had watched the security feed from Facility Obsidian herself, every second of it. So from the moment Mara Voss walked off the transport ship to the moment the patrol craft cleared the docking envelope. She had watched those flat, dark eyes in the receiving corridor, and the stillness in the cell, and the 4-second fight in the armory corridor, and the calm voice on the broadcast frequency. She did not need more data. She had seen enough. Somewhere out past the gas giant, the small patrol craft was already gone, slipped into the dark between stars, and heading toward wherever humans came from. And Facility Obsidian drifted in its orbit, still venting coolant from its lower hull, its lights still flickering, its 200-year record of impregnability sitting in pieces around it. All of it. Every alarm, every sealed door, every armed guard, every reinforced wall, undone in 63 minutes by one human woman with a needle the size of a fingernail and a mind that had simply never been taught that some problems could not be solved. The last light on the station's outer hull flickered once, then it went out,